Every week that goes by brings us closer to the fascinating and indeed consequential November election. This period in American history is one in which close elections are the norm. Nearly every vote does indeed matter. And the implication of all of this, which every political consultant knows well, is that independent and unaffiliated voters matter a great deal, and they disproportionately impact the outcomes of close elections. And yet, ironically, this crucial segment of voters who determine the outcome of important elections again and again all across our country is arguably one of the most frequently misunderstood and mischaracterized segments of the voting population in all of American politics today. Indeed, a far too often overlooked and ignored book written 16 years ago by Bruce E. Keith and 5 other authors, The Myth of the Independent Voter, concludes that it's a huge mistake to characterize independent voters as the largest segment of voters nationally, and to assume that they're totally up for grabs every cycle by either party, and to conclude that they have no meaningful party loyalties is a mistake. Instead, the reality is that there are far fewer independent voters than most political commentators and strategists realize. And furthermore, most independent voters, well, they're not really all that independent after all. Today's conventional wisdom seems to be as mistaken about the makeup of independent voters as it was when Myths was first published in 1992. And in close elections, these critical misunderstandings cost votes and they cost elections. Therefore, a couple of important points are worth highlighting in an attempt to reset the proper narrative and analysis around independent voters, arguably the most crucial voting bloc in today's closely divided American electorate. Point number 1, independent, unaffiliated voters are not monolithic. Not all independent voters are the same. Commentators speak of independents as some sort of monolithic, homogeneous group, and they're neither. Independent voters come from all races, religions, genders, ages, sexualities, states, political backgrounds, ideologies, and yes, they come from all political parties. Some independents are fiscally conservative and others are fiscally liberal. Some are libertarians, some are socialist, and some have no idea what either of these ideologies are. The key point here, one size does not fit all when it comes to understanding political independence. Point number 2, most independents have partisan leanings. The fact is that most independent voters actually lean towards one of the 2 major political parties. It's simply not true that independent voters are up for grabs every year, as some would suggest, and many have quite surprisingly strong partisan leanings. So the idea and the mistake that many have made about charting the seeming growth of independent voters is just not quite accurate. Now, while I have a great deal of respect for Gallup and the work they do, this chart is both an oversimplification and also, frankly, misleading. And needless to say, this chart from a campaign perspective, it's strategically inactionable. The supporting data suggests that the majority party identification favors independents considerably, and that this growing trend comes at the expense of the 2 major political parties. A more careful and in-depth conclusion simply doesn't reflect that reality. And in fact, even Gallup begrudgingly acknowledges when the so-called leaners are taken into account. The Democratic and Republican affiliation nationally changes from 29% and 27% respectively, all the way up to 47% and 42%, rendering the initial data pretty far off the mark. And it suggests that far from being almost half of the American electorate today, really only about 1 in 10 voters are actually political independents, and thus truly up for grabs come election day. Point number 3, know your persuadables. Therefore, careful voter targeting must be the imperative for Democratic campaigns trying to win tough races. Persuasion is hard for either party, but as an example, persuasion is hardest for Democrats among independents who lean toward the GOP. The reality is that many low-information voters, often they are independent voters, closely track the voting behaviors of their more partisan neighbors. Let me give you an example. A precinct that heavily favors the GOP means that independents who live there lean to the GOP. Democrats must leave these voters asleep. Don't phone them, don't mail them, don't digitally target them, and certainly don't knock on their doors. Democrats must be very careful not to wake up these kinds of sleepy GOP-leaning independent voters. Instead, target persuadables you need to be successful with, namely those who live in Democratic precincts and neighborhoods, or those in mixed precincts and districts who you've carefully identified. I hope you enjoyed today's myth-busting around independent voters. Be sure to hit subscribe so you know when we have new content to share, and visit honanstrategy.com for additional insights and resources. Thanks very much for tuning in today.